What if I told you that the single phone call that changes the course of this war has already been made? Not by a general, not by a diplomat, by a secretary logging a formal declaration into a system that hasn't been activated since the Cold War ended. That call, that document, means Article 5 is no longer a theory. It's a countdown. Before we get into this, and trust me, you want to stick around for all of it, hit that like button right now and smash that subscribe button. This is exactly the kind of content we cover here, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Go ahead, do it now, I'll wait. Alright, so here's where we are. For months, actually, let's be honest, for years, the conversation around NATO and this conflict has lived in this weird gray zone. NATO countries sending weapons. NATO countries training soldiers. NATO intelligence showing up in real time on Ukrainian command screens. But always with this careful, deliberate distance. Always with the language of support rather than involvement. That distance just collapsed. And I don't mean that dramatically, I mean it structurally. There are mechanisms inside the NATO alliance that, once triggered, don't reverse easily. Think of it like a door that swings one way. You can push it open slowly, you can ease through it, but once you're through, there's no quiet walk back. So what actually happens when NATO formally enters a war? Not hypothetically, not in a think tank paper. In reality, on the ground, in the next 72 hours, the next 30 days, the next 6 months. Let's break it down properly. First thing that happens, and this moves fast, is the political machinery inside Brussels kicks into gear in a way most people have never seen. The North Atlantic Council, which is basically NATO's decision-making body, goes into permanent session. Every ambassador from every member state is in that room or on that call. And here's the thing people don't fully appreciate. NATO decisions require consensus. That means 32 countries have to agree. Every single one. That sounds impossibly slow, right? It's actually not when the trigger is real and the threat is verified. Because these governments have already wargamed this. They've had classified conversations their populations don't know about. The public debate looks chaotic, but behind closed doors, the frameworks are already drafted. Within 48 hours of a formal Article 5 declaration, you'd see a cascade of national parliaments either convening emergency sessions or invoking executive war powers. Germany, which has been the most cautious of the major players, would face the biggest domestic reckoning. Their constitution, their history, their public opinion. But even Germany has a threshold. And depending on what triggered the declaration, that threshold may have already been crossed. Here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part most coverage glosses over. Article 5 doesn't automatically mean full-scale war. The language is actually more flexible than people think. It says an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, and that each member will take such action as it deems necessary. That phrase, as it deems necessary, is doing enormous heavy lifting. So the response isn't predetermined. It's calibrated. A cyber attack on NATO infrastructure? You might see a coordinated cyber response, asset freezes, maybe targeted strikes on specific nodes. A missile that crosses into Polish territory? That's a different conversation entirely. Boots on the ground inside a NATO member state? That is the scenario where the gloves come completely off. The trigger defines the response. And right now, the people in those rooms are arguing quietly, intensely, about exactly what threshold has been crossed and what that legally and militarily obligates them to do. While the diplomats are talking, the generals aren't waiting. NATO's command structure shifts immediately. SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, moves from a coordination role into an operational command role. That's not a small shift. That changes who has authority over what assets, where, and how fast they can move. Prepositioned equipment in Eastern Europe, and there is a significant amount of it, comes under active operational planning rather than deterrence planning. That distinction matters enormously. Deterrence means, we're here, so you don't try anything. Operational means, we're here and we're moving. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they've been preparing for this possibility longer than anyone wants to publicly admit. Infrastructure, logistics, supply lines, these things don't get built overnight, and they weren't built for decoration. And then there's the thing everyone is thinking about but nobody wants to say out loud. Nuclear. Look, I'm not going to sensationalize this. I'm also not going to pretend it's not sitting in the middle of the room like a 10,000-pound weight. Because the moment NATO formally enters this conflict, the nuclear calculus changes, and not in a small way. Russia's entire strategic doctrine, the thing they've built their deterrence model around for 3 decades, is based on the idea that nuclear capability creates a ceiling on conventional conflict. Meaning, if you push us far enough, we escalate to a level you can't match. That's been the implicit threat throughout this entire war. But here's what that doctrine didn't fully account for. NATO isn't one country. It's 32. And several of those 32 have their own nuclear arrangements. France has an independent deterrent that answers to Paris, not Brussels. The United States has weapons stationed across Europe under agreements that predate this conflict by 50 years. So when Russian state media starts talking about nuclear response, and they already have been, the audience for that threat isn't just Washington. It's Paris. It's London. It's every capital that now has skin in the game. Does that make nuclear use more or less likely? Honestly, most serious analysts will tell you that formal NATO involvement actually reduces the probability of nuclear use, not increases it. Because the cost calculation changes completely. A tactical nuclear strike against a NATO force isn't a message anymore. It's a suicide note. That doesn't mean the risk is zero. It means the people making these decisions on all sides understand the math better than the headlines suggest. While all of this is unfolding militarily and politically, something else happens simultaneously that most people underestimate completely. The global economy doesn't pause and wait to see how things shake out. Energy markets move within hours of a formal NATO declaration. Not days, hours. European natural gas prices, oil futures, grain commodities, all of them reprice immediately based on the new risk landscape. And because the global financial system is deeply interconnected in ways that weren't true even 20 years ago, that repricing ripples outward fast. For regular people in America, in the UK, in Australia, this shows up at the petrol station before it shows up on the news. Prices at the pump, prices at the grocery store, mortgage rates responding to bond market volatility. The war doesn't stay over there. It never really did, but now the connection becomes impossible to ignore. Defense stocks surge. That sounds cold to say, but it's what happens. Because the market knows that formal NATO involvement means procurement contracts, means production ramp-ups, means every defense manufacturer on the continent is about to have a very full order book for the next several years. Here's the angle that almost nobody in mainstream coverage is spending time on, and I think it might actually be the most important one. What happens to the countries that aren't in NATO? Because this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are governments watching this right now in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and they are drawing conclusions. Not about Russia, not about Ukraine, about the alliance itself. Does NATO's formal entry prove that the alliance is credible and its guarantees mean something? Or does the chaos and hesitation that preceded it prove that the alliance is slow, divided, and only acts when it's too late? Both conclusions are being drawn simultaneously, in different capitals by different leaders. And those conclusions will shape decisions about alliances, about nuclear programs, about who to align with for the next generation. Taiwan is watching. Iran is watching. North Korea is watching. Every country that sits in a gray zone between great powers is taking notes right now and updating their own calculations. History doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a news alert and a dramatic soundtrack. It happens in meeting rooms and on phone calls and in decisions that look incremental right up until the moment they don't. We are living through one of those moments right now. And whether you think NATO's involvement is the right call, the wrong call, or something far more complicated than either, understanding what actually happens next matters. Not the version designed to make you scared. Not the version designed to make you feel comfortable. The real version. If this gave you something to think about, if it filled in gaps that the 90-second news segment left open, then do me a favor. Hit the like button. It genuinely helps this content reach people who are looking for exactly this kind of analysis. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this is what we do here every single week. Share this with someone who's been asking these questions. Because the conversation matters, and the more people having it seriously, the better.